A May morning, 1303. The first light creeps through the Gothic arches of Westminster Abbey. A monk shuffles towards the Pyx chamber for his morning duties, keys jangling against his habit. The heavy oak door swings open. He steps inside the treasury, and his sandaled foot strikes something unexpected. Scattered coins glinting on the stone floor. His eyes adjust to the dim light. The iron-bound chests stand open, their locks hanging broken. Silks and satins lie strewn about like discarded rags. The king's treasure, the very symbol of England's sovereignty, have vanished into the London night. What happens when ambition, desperation, and opportunity collide in the darkness of Westminster Abbey? What drove a seemingly ordinary trader to orchestrate the most audacious crime of the medieval age? And how do you break into an impregnable fortress protected by both lock and prayer? You're listening to The Crow's Tales, and this is the Crown Jewels Heist of 1303. To understand why this crime shocked a nation, we first need to understand the England of 1303. Edward I, Longshanks to his subjects, and Hammer of the Scots to history, sat upon a throne that creaked under the weight of ambition. For 7 years, he'd been bleeding his gold into Scottish campaigns. That endless morass of siege and counter-siege that swallowed armies whole. The royal coffers, once flush from Jewish expulsions and French negotiations, now echoed with the hollow ring of near emptiness. Yet Edward maintained his grip on power through symbols as much as swords. The royal regalia, crowns, sceptres, rings, and ceremonial vessels. These weren't just ornaments, they were England itself, made tangible in gold and gems. When foreign ambassadors knelt before the throne, they saw in these objects the accumulated authority of centuries. When rebellious barons considered their options, they remembered the crown's weight, both literal and metaphorical. The king stored these symbols of sovereignty, along with substantial coin reserves, in what he considered the most secure vault in his realm, the Pyx chamber at Westminster Abbey. Here, beneath sacred stone and behind locks that had never been breached, lay the portable wealth of the crown, what later ages would call the Crown Jewels, though Edward's contemporaries knew them as the king's wardrobe treasure. Westminster Abbey in 1303 stood as more than a church. It functioned as the administrative and spiritual heart of the realm. Benedictine monks moved through its cloisters in their prescribed rounds of prayer, but between the holy offices, secular business hummed. The abbey housed courts, stored records, and most crucially, it safeguarded the royal treasury. The Pyx chamber itself seemed designed by paranoia. Built into the abbey's oldest surviving structure, dating from Edward the Confessor's time, the chamber took its name from the Pyx, a special box containing standard coins against which the realm's currency was tested in a ceremony that would continue for centuries. Its walls, nearly 3 feet thick, could withstand siege engines. The chamber had but 2 points of entry, a main door reinforced with iron bands and multiple locks, and a connecting passage into the chapter house, itself secured behind layers of ecclesiastical security. The abbey's location provided another layer of protection. Westminster sat apart from the City of London, a royal enclave where the king's peace held absolute sway. King's guards patrolled the precincts, monks maintained their watches. The very sanctity of the space, this was holy ground after all, should have deterred any Christian soul from the contemplation of theft. Yet every fortress has its weakness, and Westminster's lay not in its stones but in its routines. The monks who guarded the treasury followed patterns unchanged for generations. They opened doors at prescribed hours, walked established routes, and trusted in the impregnability of tradition. Someone watching, someone patient, could map these patterns like a navigator charting the stars. Richard de Pudnicott was a Westminster merchant dealing in wool and wine. Not nobility, certainly, but not common either. He occupied that profitable middle ground where commerce met administration, where a clever man with ready cash could rise above his birth. Pudnicott knew the abbey's rhythms because he'd observed them for years. not as a thief scouts a target, but as a local man knows his neighbourhood. Monks complained into their ale about night duties and broken locks that took weeks to repair. When he delivered goods near the abbey, he watched the sacrist, a church official responsible for the care of the church, its contents and its ground, hurry past with his ring of keys, always the same route, always the same hour. The transformation from merchant to mastermind began, most likely, with debt. Edward's wars had strangled trade. Wool shipments rotted in warehouses while the king commandeered ships for his Scottish adventures. Credit dried up. Merchants who'd grown comfortable found themselves desperate, and desperation, as any confessor could tell you, makes sinners of saints. By the winter of 1302, Pudnicott had made his decision. But knowing the abbey's weakness and exploiting it were different matters entirely. He would need help. In the taverns of Westminster, away from the abbey's sacred shadow, Pudnicott began his recruitment. He started with William of the Palace, a minor official whose love of dice had left him owing money to the sort of men who collected debts in blood. William knew the Palace of Westminster like a lover knows his mistress's moods. Every passage, every hidden door, every guard who could be relied upon to drink himself insensible by midnight. Next came John of Newmarket, a smith whose legitimate trade in locks and keys masked a particular talent for opening doors that should stay closed. John had learnt his craft honestly enough, apprenticed to a master locksmith. But hunger had taught him that locks could be picked as easily as made. He could read a lock's mechanism by touch alone, feeling the pins and tumblers through his tools like a physician feels a pulse. Adam the clerk brought a different skill. He understood how the abbey's administration worked, which documents were checked and which gathered dust. When the treasury was audited, how long before a missing item would be noticed. More importantly, he had access to wax and could take impressions of keys during his legitimate business in the chapter house. The conspiracy grew through the winter months. Each man brought others. A porter who knew which walls were hollow. A hemp merchant who could supply rope that wouldn't fray against stone. A goldsmith whose morals were bent as easily as soft metal. They met in different locations, never the same tavern twice, speaking in metaphors that would sound innocent to any casual listener. They were merchants discussing a venture, nothing more. Some conspirators had connections inside the abbey itself. Not monks, or at least one hoped not monks, but the small army of lay workers who kept the great church functioning. These men heard confessions of a different sort. Which brother had been disciplined for sleeping through matins? Which doors were left unlocked when they shouldn't be? When the sacrist would be in London on business? Information flowed like water finding the cracks in stones. Through February and March, Pudnicott refined his plan with the obsession of a man whose life depended on perfection, which, of course, it did. The gallows waited for thieves who stole from the crown. The physical challenge alone would have defeated lesser criminals. The treasury contained not just coins, but a massive ceremonial plate. The coronation cup weighed near 5 pounds of solid gold. The great chains of state could barely be lifted by a single man. There were crosses studded with gems, chalices of silver gilt, rings that had graced royal fingers for centuries. All of this would need to be moved, silently, in complete darkness, through passages where a single wrong turn meant discovery. Pudnicott solved the problem methodically. The heaviest items would be wrapped in felt to prevent clanking. They'd use sledges, not carried, but dragged on cloths to muffle sound. The work would be divided, some men to break locks, others to carry, and others to stand watch. Every movement choreographed, every contingency anticipated. The tools had to be acquired carefully, a file here, a crowbar there, never enough to raise suspicion. John of Newmarket made some tools himself, working late at night when his customers had gone. Others were purchased from different smiths across London, paid for in coin that couldn't be traced. By April, they had everything. Files rough and fine, crowbars wrapped in leather, hammers with muffled heads, lanterns with shields to direct light, sacks of varying sizes, and most crucially, a set of wax impressions from which John had crafted skeleton keys. Timing would make or break them. Too early in the year and the long nights provided cover, but the cold made fingers clumsy and guards more alert. Too late and the short summer nights left insufficient darkness. They needed a night when the Abbey's routines were disrupted, but not so much that extra watches were posted. The end of April 1303 offered the perfect opportunity. Easter had passed, taking with it the crowds of pilgrims and heightened security. The monks had returned to their ordinary rhythm of prayer and administration. Most importantly, Pudnicott had learnt that on the night of April the 30th, the sacrist, keeper of the keys, would be attending a feast in the abbot's lodgings. The feast would run late and wine would flow freely. The morning watches would be slower, groggier, less inclined to investigate strange sounds. The conspirators also arranged their aftermath with meticulous care. The treasure would be divided into 3 caches, hidden in different locations across Westminster and London. The most recognisable pieces, those bearing royal arms, would be melted down immediately. Gems would be pried from their settings and sold separately. Foreign coins could enter circulation without raising alarms. They had buyers waiting in Dover and Bristol, ships ready to carry certain items to Flanders, where English royal plate could be sold as mere gold. William of the Palace had prepared 3 separate safe houses where conspirators could hide if the initial search grew too hot. Adam the clerk had already begun creating false documents that could provide alibis. They'd even arranged for several conspirators to be visibly drunk in various taverns that night, establishing their presence far from the Abbey. April 30th came grey and drizzly, the kind of day that sent men hurrying indoors and kept them there. Perfect weather for thieves. As afternoon faded to evening, Pudnicott sat alone in the upper room of the house he'd rented near the Abbey, watching the last light die over Westminster's rooftops. His hands trembled slightly as he poured wine, then set the cup down untouched. 4 months of planning had led to this moment, and now it had arrived. His body betrayed him with 100 small rebellions. His stomach churned, his mouth went dry no matter how much ale he drank. A muscle in his left eye twitched, had been for 3 days now. No amount of rubbing would make it stop. His accomplices arrived one by one, using different entrances, wearing the anonymous brown and grey of common labourers. Pudnicott spread out his hand-drawn map of the Abbey one last time. The crypt entrance they'd chosen had been used for storage generations ago, but newer construction had sealed it off and it had been forgotten. John of Newmarket had spent 3 nights working on the exterior grating, loosening bars that appeared solid but would now swing free at a touch. From there, a narrow passage led up through the foundations, emerging behind a painted wooden panel in the chapel of the Pyx itself. The conspirators blackened their faces with soot and wrapped their tools in dark cloth. Each man knew his task. John would handle the locks, William would navigate them through the passages, Adam would stand watch at the critical junction where the Pyx chamber connected to the chapter house. The stronger men would handle the heavy lifting, and Pudnicott himself would direct the operation and make the crucial decisions about what to take and what to leave. As the Abbey bells chimed, the monks filed into church for the last service of the day. The conspirators watched from their window as lights appeared in the church windows. They heard the distant sound of plainsong drifting across the yard. In an hour, the monks would retire. In 2 hours, the Abbey would be asleep except for a single watchman who, if their intelligence proved correct, would have a belly full of ale and be nodding off over his brazier near the main gate, far from the Pyx chamber. When they left their house and stepped into the darkness of the London streets, the mist from the Thames wrapped around them like a conspirator's cloak. Pudnicott's heart still hammered, but his hands were steady now. The paralysing fear had transformed into something else. A terrible clarity that seemed to slow time itself. Every shadow might hide disaster. Every footstep might be their last as free men. If they failed, they would hang at Tyburn before the month was out. The Abbey loomed before them, its stones black against the starless sky. Somewhere within those walls lay gold enough to buy a small kingdom. By dawn, if it all went according to plan, that gold would be theirs. The greatest heist in England's history had begun. The conspirators moved through Westminster streets like wraiths. The mist had thickened, muffling sound and swallowing light. Perfect conditions, as if God himself, or perhaps the devil, had drawn a veil across their crime. They reached the forgotten grating at the base of the Abbey's north wall, just as the last echoes of the church service faded into silence. John of Newmarket knelt beside the iron bars, running his fingers along the edges where he'd spent 3 nights carefully working the mortar loose. The bars swung free with barely a whisper of protest. One by one, the men dropped through the opening into the narrow passage below. Pudnicott went last, pulling the grate closed behind them. From the outside, it would appear undisturbed. The passage reeked of centuries, damp stone, rat droppings, the fungal breath of spaces never touched by sun. They moved in single file, John leading with a shuttered lantern that leaked just enough light to show the next step. The passage had been built when the original abbey stood here, before the Normans came, before anyone alive could remember. Newer construction had sealed it off, forgotten it, but Pudnicott's careful research had found references in old building accounts, mentions of the lower way, that no longer appeared on any plan. The ceiling pressed lower as they advanced, forcing them to duck, then crawl. William of the Palace, broader than the others, struggled through the narrowest section, his breathing harsh with barely controlled panic. Behind him, Adam the clerk whispered prayers or curses. It was impossible to tell which. The passage seemed to go on forever, a stone throat swallowing them whole. Then John's hand went up. Stop. Listen. Above them, footsteps crossed the floor. A monk making his rounds, checking doors, ensuring all was secure for the night. The footsteps paused directly overhead. Had he heard something? The conspirators held their breaths, hearts hammering so loud they must be audible through the stone. The moment stretched like rope about to snap. But the footsteps moved on. They emerged behind a painted wooden panel depicting St. Peter receiving the keys of heaven. An irony not lost on Pudnicott, as he watched John work his own earthly keys. The chapel of the Picts lay in darkness save for a single sanctuary light burning before the altar. Its red light made the shadows dance like demons at the Sabbath. Here they split according to plan. Adam took up position where he could watch both the door to the main church and the passage to the chapter house. If anyone approached, he would knock 3 times on the floor. The sound would carry through the stones to the chamber below. 2 of the stronger men began setting up the sledges and bags near the panel, ready to receive whatever treasure emerged. John, William, and Pudnicott moved toward the iron door that guarded the Picts' chamber itself. The door was a masterwork of medieval security. 3 separate locks, each requiring a different key. Iron bands reinforced the oak planks, studded with nails that would turn aside any axe. But John of Newmarket had not come with axes. He produced his carefully crafted keys, filed from wax impressions taken over months of patient observation. The key turned smoothly. The second stuck, and for a terrible moment, Pudnicott thought it would break in the lock. John worked it gently, feeling for the resistance, adjusting the angle until the mechanism yielded. The third lock was the oldest, its workings worn smooth by centuries of use. It opened almost eagerly, as if it had been waiting. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, and Pudnicott stepped into the chamber that had haunted his dreams. The Picts' chamber in the deep of night was a dragon's hoard made real. Even in the dim light of their shuttered lanterns, gold gleamed from every surface. Chests lined the wall, some bound in iron, others in brass that caught the light like captured fire. A table in the centre held items too precious or too frequently needed to be locked away. Ceremonial vessels, signed documents, leather bags that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coin. But it was the crown that drew Pudnicott's eye. Not the great crown of state, that was kept elsewhere, but a circlet of gold set with sapphires the size of a child's thumb, resting on a cushion of purple silk. He reached for it, then stopped. They had a plan. Stick to the plan. The most valuable items first, the most portable, leaving anything too easily identified for last. John had already moved the largest chest, running his hand over the lock like a man reading scripture in the dark. This was no simple mechanism, but a puzzle lock, designed to defeat exactly such attempts as this. But John had encountered its like before, in the workshop of the master who'd made it. The same master who'd trained him before the drink claimed the old man's steady hands. While John worked, Pudnicott and William began with the smaller chests. The first yielded bags of gold nobles, each coin bearing Edward's stern profile. The second held silver pennies, so many they couldn't hope to carry them all. The third contained gems, rubies like drops of blood, emeralds green as deep water, some as large as quail's eggs. They worked in efficient silence, loading the sledges and filling bags. Every few minutes, they froze at some sound, real or imagined, from above. Once, Adam knocked twice on the floor, the signal for caution, until finally a single knock came, indicating all clear. John's triumph, when it came, was nearly their undoing. The great chest's lock surrendered with a sound like a bell striking. Not loud, but so unexpected in the silence that it might as well have been thunder. They froze, waiting for shouts, for running feet, for discovery. Nothing. The Abbey slept on. Inside the great chest lay the true treasures of the realm. The coronation cup, so heavy Pudnicott could barely lift it with both hands. Ceremonial swords with hilts wrapped in gold wire, their scabbards studded with gems. A gospel book with covers of gold and ivory, its clasps fashioned like angels. Chalices from the royal chapel, each worth more than a merchant might see in a lifetime. They took it all. As they worked, Pudnicott felt a strange euphoria building. They were doing it, actually doing it. The impregnable fortress had been breached. The king's own treasure was flowing into their bags like water from a broken dam. Each item they packed was a year's comfort, a decade's security, a lifetime's transformation. But time was their enemy now. They'd been inside too long. Dawn would come in 3 hours, and they needed to be far away from here when it did. Pudnicott made the hard choice, gesturing to leave all the remaining silver coins. Gold and gems only now. What they had would be enough to make them all wealthy. William couldn't resist. As they prepared to leave, he grabbed one more prize, a gilt leopard, its eyes set with rubies. The thing was worth a fortune, but also unmistakably royal. Pudnicott wanted to stop him, but didn't dare speak. The leopard went into the bag. The return journey should have been easier. They knew the route now, knew what to expect, but the sledges caught on every irregularity in the stone floor. The bags, swollen with treasure, had to be pushed and pulled through narrow passage. What had taken minutes on the way in stretched to an eternity on the way out. Pudnicott went first this time, pulling the heaviest sledge. Behind him, he could hear John cursing softly as bags shifted and threatened to spill. The gold seemed to have gained weight, as if the very metal resented being stolen. Every shadow might hide a guard who'd noticed the disturbed grating. Every sound might herald their doom. They emerged into the misty pre-dawn like men reborn from the grave. The conspirators who'd remained outside had horses and cart waiting, covered with hay as if for morning delivery. The treasure went underneath, distributed so the cart wouldn't list suspiciously to one side. In minutes, they were moving through the streets, just another group of merchants getting an early start on the day's business. But Pudnicott couldn't shake the feeling that something had been too easy. Westminster Abbey, the most secure treasure in England, breached by a handful of merchants and clerks. As they separated, each group heading to different safe houses, he wondered if they'd truly succeeded, or if they'd simply walked into a trap that hadn't yet sprung. Brother Francis arrived at the Pyx chamber just after the first service of the day, the morning prayers still echoing in the church above. He'd spent a sleepless night worrying about the keys the sacrist had entrusted to him, and had risen early to check that all remained secure. The door stood closed, locked, apparently undisturbed, but something made him pause. A scatter of stone dust on the floor that hadn't been there yesterday. A scuff mark on the doorframe. He turned the keys in the locks, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. For a moment, his mind simply refused to process what he saw. The great chest standing open, its puzzle luck hanging like a broken jaw, empty bags strewn across the floor, coins scattered and glinting in the morning light. The few the thieves had dropped in their haste. The purple cushion that held the sapphire circlet now bearing only the ghostly impression of vanished gold. Brother Francis's scream brought the entire abbey running. Within an hour, riders were galloping towards Scotland, where Edward held court with his army. The king's reaction, witnesses would say later, was terrible to behold. His rage shook the very tent. Maps were swept from tables, advisers cowered. The Scottish campaign, so carefully planned, would have to wait. The king would return to London immediately. "Find them," he roared. "Find every last one of them. And when you do, I want them brought to me alive. They'll learn what it means to steal from the crown. They'll beg for death before I'm finished." The royal investigation began before Edward even reached London. Writs went out to every sheriff in England. Ports were closed. The City of London's gates were barred. No one in or out without examination. Every goldsmith, every jeweller, every merchant of precious goods found himself under scrutiny. The investigators, hard men who'd learned their trade in Edward's Scottish wars, began with the abbey itself. Every monk, every servant, every person who'd had any business there in the past year was questioned. The interrogations started politely enough, but as the days passed with no breakthrough, they grew harsher. It was the gold that began to surface first. A merchant in Southwark tried to pay a debt with coins too fine for his station. A goldsmith in Cheapside was caught with a chalice he claimed to have bought from a Fleming, but couldn't name. Piece by piece, the stolen treasure began to reappear, and with each discovery, the net drew tighter. The conspirators, meanwhile, were learning the hard truth that Podnicott had always feared. Stealing the king's treasure was one thing, but keeping it was another entirely. They couldn't spend it. Every gold noble was being watched out for. They couldn't sell it. Every fence in London had gone to ground rather than risk Edward's wrath. They couldn't even flee. The ports were sealed tighter than the Picts chamber had ever been. Some of the conspirators cracked under the pressure. John of St Albans, one of the minor players, was caught trying to bury his share in a churchyard at midnight. Under interrogation, the kind that involved hot irons and stretched joints, he gave up 3 names. Those 3, when taken, gave up even more. By the end of May, barely 3 weeks after the theft, the investigation had identified most of the conspirators, but not Podnicott. He'd been too careful, his planning too meticulous. While others had panicked and made mistakes, he'd hidden his share and continued his normal business, even expressing appropriate outrage at the sacrilege when discussing it in taverns. It was William of the Palace who betrayed him in the end. Not intentionally. William died under torture without speaking Podnicott's name. But among his possessions, investigators found a single item. A key. Not one of John's crafted keys, but an original, one that opened a door in Westminster Palace. A door that led to a passage that collected to another passage, and that passage, the investigators discovered, could only have been known to someone with very specific knowledge of the palace's construction. The trail led to a series of building contracts from 5 years earlier. Among the merchants who'd supplied materials was a wine and wool trader named Richard de Podnicott. The arrest came at dawn on June 2nd, 1303. Podnicott woke to find his room full of armed men. He didn't resist. He knew this moment could come as soon as Brother Francis screamed. In a way, it was almost a relief. As they dragged him from his house, Podnicott caught a glimpse of the abbey's towers in the rising sun. For 1 month, he'd been the richest man in England, even if he couldn't spend a penny of it. For 1 month, he'd held the king's power in his hands, even if it burned him to hold it. Now, the reckoning had come. They brought Podnicott to the Tower of London in chains, as the Thames tide ran high. The water lapped at the stone steps like a hungry tongue. Other prisoners watched from barred windows as he passed. Nobles awaiting trial for treason, debtors who might never see daylight again, and in the deepest cells, those who existed now only to provide information through whatever means necessary. Podnicott's interrogation began gently, almost courteously. A clerk with ink-stained fingers sat ready to record every word. The questioner, Hugh de Cressingham, who served as the king's special investigator, laid out exactly what they already knew, like a merchant displaying his wares. They had John of Newmarket, who'd confessed to making keys. They had Adam the clerk, who'd provided the inside knowledge. They had recovered nearly half the treasure, though the best pieces, including the sapphire circlet, remained missing. They knew about the passage through the crypt, about the meeting places in London taverns, about the network of fences and smugglers waiting to move the goods. The investigators made it clear they had enough evidence to hang him 3 times over, but the king wanted more. He wanted every conspirator, every piece of treasure, every detail about how his sacred trust was violated. The choice was simple: cooperate fully and hang quickly, or resist and discover what the king had learned from his Scottish campaigns about making death last. Podnicott held out for 3 days. On the 4th day, after experiencing the king's Scottish innovations firsthand, Podnicott broke. His confession, transcribed in the precise Latin of the royal clerks, ran to 20 pages. He named 48 conspirators, from major players to the boy who'd held the horses outside the abbey. He detailed every meeting, every payment, every tool purchase and key copied. He drew maps of the passages, diagrams of the locks, and lists of what was taken and where it was hidden. Edward returned to London in late June, his Scottish campaign abandoned, his rage undiminished by the journey. He read Podnicott's confession in one sitting, then ordered the prisoners brought before him, not for trial, that would come later, but so he could look upon the faces of men audacious enough to steal from God and king alike. The king's fury was legendary. Witnesses reported that his rage shook the very walls of Westminster Hall, that strong men cowered before his wrath. The Scottish campaign, so carefully planned and provisioned, would have to wait. Justice demanded his presence. The morning of July 14th, 1303, dawned grey and oppressive. The kind of summer day when the air hangs heavy as wet wool, and even breathing feels like work. From somewhere beyond the city walls came the distant cawing of crows, that harsh chorus that seemed to follow death wherever it went. The birds knew, as they always did, that today the gallows would feed them. 10 men were drawn on hurdles from the Tower to Tyburn, bumping and scraping through the streets lined with London crowds. The journey, which should have taken an hour, stretched to 3 as people pressed in to see the infamous thieves. Some threw rubbish, others just stared. A few, perhaps those who'd lost their own fortunes to Edward's war, watched with something almost like sympathy. The gallows at Tyburn had been specially reinforced for the occasion. 10 nooses swayed in the summer breeze. A priest offered last rites. His Latin rushed through the formulas as if eager to be done with this grim business. The sky seemed to press lower as the moment approached, and even the crows fell silent, perched on the trees nearby like black-robed judges waiting to pronounce their own verdict. Podnicott was the last to hang, forced to watch his conspirators die one by one. John of Newmarket went quietly, his locksmith's hands steady even as they placed the noose around his neck. William of the Palace sobbed and had to be hauled up to the scaffold. Adam the clerk prayed loudly until the drop silenced him. When Podnicott's turn came, he looked over the crowd one last time. Somewhere in that sea of faces were other desperate men, other ambitious souls who thought they could beat the system, steal from the powerful, rise above their station through audacity alone. His knees trembled beneath him, every breath shallow and ragged. The world had shrunk to the sound of his pounding heart, a desperate drumbeat counting down the final seconds before oblivion. The hood went over his head, the noose tightened, and the crowd grew quiet. The trapdoor opened. Edward ordered that the bodies be left hanging for a week, a reminder to all who passed of the price of theft from the crown. Eventually, they were cut down and buried in unmarked graves, denied even the dignity of consecrated ground. The investigation continued for months afterwards. More conspirators were discovered, though most received lesser punishments now that the king's immediate rage had cooled. The monks who'd been bribed lost their positions and were sent to remote monasteries to live out their days in penance and shame. Westminster Abbey instituted new security measures. The Pyx chamber was reinforced, new locks installed, the forgotten passages sealed with stone and mortar. The treasury was moved repeatedly over the following years, Edward never fully trusting any single location with the symbols of his authority. Of the stolen treasure, perhaps 2/3 was eventually recovered. The rest vanished into the underground economy of medieval Europe, melted down, broken apart, sold and resold until its origins were forgotten. Somewhere, perhaps, a fragment of the coronation cup became a merchant's ring. A ruby from the gilt leopard might have ended up in a bishop's staff. The crime echoed through centuries in unexpected ways. Richard de Podnicott entered history as both villain and folk hero. To the authorities, he was a cautionary tale about the price of treason. To the common people, he became something else. A man who dared to take what the powerful hoarded, who'd proven that even the mightiest fortress could fall to clever planning and desperate courage. Songs were sung about him in taverns, though never when the watch was near. Parents told their children about the merchant who stole the king's gold, though the moral of the story varied with the teller. Some said it proved that crime never pays, others whispered that Podnicott's real crime was getting caught. In the end, he achieved a strange sort of immortality. 7 centuries later, his name still appears in the histories. The Westminster Heist remains one of the most audacious thefts in medieval England, a crime so bold that it transcended mere criminality to become legend. He'd wanted to be more than a middling merchant, to rise above his station, to matter. In that, at least, he succeeded. The Pyx chamber still stands today, tucked away in the cloisters of Westminster Abbey. Tourists pass by it every day, most unaware of its history. But sometimes, especially on misty mornings when the Thames fog rolls in, you can almost imagine you hear the scratch of files on iron, the whisper of conspirators in the darkness, the clink of stolen gold being loaded into sacks. The greatest heist in England's history lives on, not in the treasure that was stolen, but in the audacity of the attempt. A reminder that sometimes, for one brilliant, terrible moment, the desperate and the clever can bring the powerful to their knees, even if they hang for it in the end. Well then, there you have it. If you've watched this far and like what you've heard, then consider liking and subscribing. Also, you can hit the notification bell if you want to be notified of future stories. I release a new one every Sunday. As a new channel, this really helps not only push these stories in front of more of you lovely people, but helps reassure me I'm not just sending these off into the ether, never to be seen again. If you've listened this far and don't like what you've heard, then, what on earth are you doing? Right then, off you pop. Thanks for listening.